Saipan's southwest corner, infantry and tanks strike simultaneously. Deep inland, artillery pounds a ridge above Point Nafultan.
June 1944, the Battle of Saipan, the Pacific's D-Day. It was the beginning of the end of the Pacific War and Japan's Pacific Empire. Saipan was more than an island fortress. It was part of Japan. A prize for siding with England against Germany during the First World War. For thousands of Japanese settlers, it was the jewel in their empire. Those who feared the shame of defeat climbed the cliffs for the last banzai. "4,000 suicides. In all, 30,000 Japanese dead, 14,000 Americans, for an island the size of Manhattan. From here, American bombers were within range of the cities of Japan.
Good morning, good morning. 高いなあ、ここ。ちょっとね、ちょっと岩のそば。そこ見える？一番奥の方が万歳岬。
The Banzai and Suicide Cliffs of Saipan are still under American protection, but the tourist trade is Japanese.
Suicide Cliff. Suicide Cliff.
Saipan is Japan's Bermuda. Its battlefields are part of the package tour. The spirit of war has been banished. This is the story of a generation that's been delivered power without the sacrifice of blood and steel.
Okay, beautiful. One more time. はい、どうぞ。ここ見てください。みんな笑って。
A British visitor to Japan once said the inhabitants were too grotesque and savage to be civilized. That was in 1860. In 1860, the Japanese had no contact with the modern world. They'd been confined to their own islands for 2.5 centuries. Today, there's no question the Japanese are civilized, tasteful, modern. The biggest influence of change in Japan has been the United States. Japan is what it is today because of decisions made during the American occupation. That was when the United States held all the power in the Pacific. Japan is now the world's financial superpower. The exchange of roles took 40 years.
Japanese economic power, is to a certain extent the stepchild of American policy.
The irony is that today we come down to a situation in which Japan has virtually no strategic significance and is the world's richest nation.
Well, revitalization is a manifestation of self-interest. We wanted to reconstruct our nation, not by military means, but by economic means, that's all.
Japan is no longer the stepchild of American policy. The new Pacific superpower is now the world's fastest growing consumer market. That growth could never be fueled by Japan's own resources. Japan's wartime Pacific territories are now part of a huge trading empire. Small countries desperate for export revenue compete with each other to sell off their resources for the lowest price. Timber is a buyer's market. 3/4 of the world's wood chips go to Japan. Japan's special claim to tap the Pacific's resources is based on economics, history, and myth. In the 13th century, a Mongol invasion fleet was destroyed by a typhoon. Tradition describes it as a wind from heaven, the kamikaze, the spirit of divine protection. Japan's right to national survival had the ultimate authority. Centuries of isolation confirmed the mystique and the reality. No contact, no invasion, no trade, no wealth. It was the United States Navy that forced Japan to trade. Commodore Perry brought up message from the president, trade or be invaded. The top hat came to Yokohama in 1853, where they still celebrate the American awakening. A new generation of materialists decided trade, industry, and imperialism would deliver Japan from its natural state of poverty. By the end of the century, they were ready to set off to conquer an empire. Famous victories over China, Russia, and Korea gave Japan international respect as a modern power. In the 1930s, the Imperial Army moved into Manchuria and China, then pushed south to take the resources of Europe's Asian colonies. America's trade ban was treated with contempt. The preemptive strike on Pearl Harbor was the unforgivable victory that provoked the United States to destroy Japan. In the war's last months, the bloody sacrifices of the suicide pilots was to revive the kamikaze spirit, but the retaliation was without mercy. 2.5 million Japanese died. 400,000 in American bombing raids. Half of them in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Never before had a people been so totally devastated, from awakening to destruction in 8 decades. Japan's destiny was surrendered to its first invader.
At the Little White House in Potsdam, Generalissimo Stalin of Russia is one of the first to welcome the president, as the meeting is recorded by Signal Corps and newsreel cameras.
Just before the final onslaught, the United States met its allies at Potsdam in Germany to to decide how to curb Japan's ambitions for all time. President Truman played down America's own ambitions.
We're not fighting for conquest. There's not one piece of territory or one thing of a monetary nature that we want out of this war. We want peace and prosperity for the world as a whole.
Decisions made at Potsdam were momentous. Japan's empire was to be confiscated. For the first time, the United States took the major role in defining the world's balance of power. The occupation of Japan was in the hands of the Supreme Allied Commander of the Pacific. He flew in from Manila to take control, General Douglas MacArthur.
I'll never forget that day, August 30, 1945. That was the day General MacArthur landed in Japan to start the occupation. And after a few steps down, he looked around and saw all the war correspondents who were there. And his first words were, "It's been a long way from Melbourne to Tokyo, and now we've come for the payoff." I've thought about that word payoff ever since. I think it paid off very well for the Allies, and it paid off pretty well for the Japanese.
But the payoff was some years away. With the expulsion from their empire, the Japanese lost life, face, and power. With the mines, farms, and markets of Asia gone, they were returned to the poverty of their own islands.
The first step in Operation Peace was to disband the enemy army and destroy its weapons, to literally beat their swords into plowshares, even the samurai swords, symbols of warlike authority, so that every trace of the military power and the military tradition of Japan should be eradicated.
Once Japan's war-making potential was destroyed, MacArthur's orders were to reform the basic elements of the state. He wanted to completely remake Japanese society into a peace-loving, Western-style democracy.
The Supreme Commander, General Douglas MacArthur, arrives to take the chair at the first meeting of the Allied Control Council for Japan in Tokyo.
The Allies agreed with MacArthur. Japan's aggressive tendency had to be curbed by law. A new constitution was drafted to include a unique clause. Japan renounced the right to go to war.
I therefore commend Japan's proposal for the renunciation of war to the thoughtful consideration of all of the peoples of the world.
By the new Constitution, women are voting for the first time. Formerly, the country was ruled from the top. A few people made the decisions. Now, everybody is in on the act.
The Constitution was full of democratic reforms. It guaranteed civil liberties and human rights. Trade unions and all political parties, including the communists who were released from jail. The reforms were endorsed by the new democratic parliament.
The original instructions to MacArthur specifically stated that he was not to have the responsibility for rebuilding the Japanese economy, that was to be a Japanese responsibility. However, what he should do was democratize the economy to the extent that he could in order to assure a wide distribution of income and of the ownership of the means of production. And that's precisely what MacArthur was trying to do.
A major change has taken place in the status of the Japanese farmer. By the Reform Act of December 1946, 2 million tenant farmers have been enabled to purchase the land they work. Large farms have been divided, and the great landlords no longer dominate the many farmers who used to work their land.
For the Japanese, land reform was revolutionary change. For the Americans, it was practical common sense to stimulate incentives at society's most basic level.
Land reform, in my opinion, is one of the great accomplishments of the occupation. And MacArthur enthusiastically supported it because he felt it would build up a nation of small capitalists. Nosaka, who was the leader of the Communist Party, who's still living, 97 years old, I understand, told me personally that that had made his program for the nationalization of land extremely difficult to accomplish.
To complete the democratization of Japan's economy, the occupation decided to break up the monopolies that had been the engine of the war effort, the zaibatsu as they were called. The occupation's motivation to dismantle the Mitsubishi zaibatsu was strong. It had created the Zero Fighter. All the zaibatsu had made huge profits from the war. Where the military had conquered, they had reaped the economic rewards. Together, they had scoured the entire Pacific region for every kind of resource, including human labor. They created a massively expanded Japan, a true empire.
I don't think many Americans appreciate really how gigantic the largest of these zaibatsu were. The big four constituted 1/4 of the total paid-up capital of the country. Mitsui Trading alone accounted for 1/5 of the nation's total imports. This is one trading company of one zaibatsu.
It wasn't only the size and their role in the war that offended MacArthur and his team. The zaibatsu were controlled by a handful of men. But the plan to decentralize that power and purge the men at the top was to meet with strong resistance in Japan and the United States. The purge of Japan's wartime politicians met with greater public acceptance. The Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal was convened to judge and punish the ringleaders who had taken the people to war.
All personnel, be safe. The International Military Tribunal, Far East, now in session.
Its main target was General Hideki Tojo, the wartime prime minister. He was charged with conspiracy to wage war and crimes against peace and humanity, including the reckless exploitation of resources and labor throughout the Pacific region. Instead of being shamefaced and repentant, Tojo was defiant.
That's your affidavit? Yes.
His massive defense document justified everything done in the pursuit of an empire as the consequence of Japan's forced entry into the modern world. The United States encouraged Japan to modernize, but didn't understand that Japan was a have-not nation which needed colonies. Instead of going to war with each other, he said, they should have joined forces to fight Asian communism. Tojo's execution was meant to be a clear warning to the people. Military policies were wrong. Tojo's strong defense confused the message.
It's true to say that many people were in favor of the war crime trials and the punishment of the guilty. Public opinion at the time was definitely in favor, but there were many people who thought that Tojo was the scapegoat. In a way, Tojo took the blame on behalf of the whole nation. At the time, some people even said that Tojo had died in place of the emperor.
The decision not to punish the emperor also sent confusing signals to the people. Conservatives had convinced the Truman administration that Japan needed continuity at the top. America's pre-war ambassador said, without the queen in the hive, the worker bees would go mad. To separate him from the mythical past, the Son of Heaven traded his divinity for a Hamburg. He would inspire people to work hard and forget destiny. The emperor's survival encouraged the old guard, but inflamed the newly liberated left. Their path to a revolutionary destiny was soon to be blocked. The United States was now embroiled in the global Cold War.
The eyes of the world center on China, where Red armies storm south across the Yangtze River and threaten Shanghai. Here are brought into sharp focus the great issues at stake between Russia and the West.
Victory for the communists would put China in the Soviet bloc. President Truman made a major decision committing the United States to fight world communism, the Truman Doctrine.
The theory that he presented was it must be the policy of the United States to come to the defense of the nations of the world who were then being besieged by communism, whether that attack was taking place from within the country or from without.
Japan's left had been inspired by American reforms, but disappointed by their own conservative government. On May Day, 1946, 500,000 marchers besieged the Imperial Palace, demanding workers' control and socialist policies. Conservatives in Japan and the United States were alarmed. They saw the fight against international communism being undermined in Japan. Newsweek magazine accused MacArthur's occupation of fomenting Red Revolution.
At that time, I felt there was a very considerable danger of that. The communist unions are very strong. They were tolerated by the occupation, or by elements of the occupation. The Japanese in 1945, in the fall, got a very strange impression when staff cars from GHQ went around the Sugamo prison and released all the communist leaders. The Japanese thought, naturally, the Americans wanted us to be communist.
Almost every proposal that was made by the occupation that was carried out during the entire occupation was criticized by the Japanese government in general as something that would cause anarchy, chaos, and confusion. We heard those three words over and over again, as well as communism.
Japan's leading post-war politician, Shigeru Yoshida, often used those same words himself. The plans to break up the Zaibatsu were, he said, communistic. The war had been an unfortunate mistake. It was Japan's historic stumble. It would not be repeated if the right people were in control. Yoshida's chance to push the occupation away from its pro-labor bias came at the beginning of 1947, when the unions called a general strike. MacArthur forced their leaders to call it off. Their tearful public performance put an end to dreams of radical change. The reform process was going through a major reassessment.
How far shall Japan be allowed to go in rebuilding her industries? It is perhaps the most difficult problem we face in Japan.
MacArthur's support for the Zaibatsu breakup and the purge of businessmen was the next casualty. Newsweek magazine led the campaign.
By 1947, Truman himself found out what the occupation was doing in Japan. That is, not building up anything, destroying too much. They had the opposite opinion. They wanted to build up Japan.
In March 1948, Washington responded. Undersecretary of the Army William S. Draper was sent to talk sense into General MacArthur. Nicknamed the Wall Street General, Draper planned a buildup of industry and trade. To resist communism, Japan must be made strong again. MacArthur had to agree. No more breakup, no more purge. The occupation marched into reverse course.
It took an enormous amount of pressure from Washington, but eventually we got MacArthur to do it on the grounds that we said that we thought that he thought at this stage of the occupation the purge should end. So we gave him credit for the idea that it should now end. Once we phrased it that way, then it was acceptable to him. You had to deal with him like an Oriental potentate and make it clear that we were not trying to change his views, but that he originally thought of the idea and now we agreed with him. It was that approach. It's a very diplomatic approach.
Japan was now to be the workshop of Asia. Aid would rebuild the economy. Trade would rebuild the region. The most likely export industry, textiles, was boosted with a huge shipment of American cotton. The economic recovery of Japan was now the key to the struggle against communism in Asia.
Americans changed their focus very quickly. No longer was China going to be the pivot or hub of a strategic crescent in Asia. Japan was going to play that role. Just as Germany became the anchor of resistance to Soviet expansion in Europe, Japan would play that role, an industrialized country. And even though there was no formal Marshall Plan for Japan, American aid programs performed a very similar function in post-war Japan. The Japanese became the vehicle of our hopes, a democratic, industrialized, anti-communist nation that would bring order to the chaos of Asia.
By 1950, it was clear to the Japanese that they would not be pushed back to feudal poverty. Within the shield of American protection, they could successfully cut a new way to wealth, power, and leisure. 4 decades later, people whose grandparents were told, work or starve, are now persuaded to spend more and play. It's as if the historic stumble of the war years never happened. At the Tokyo Space Camp, kids prepare for the next part of the journey. The technology, the policies, and the will for the Japanese to escape the limits of their island poverty were already in place by the end of the 40s. As far as the United States was concerned, the workshop of Asia was to be the model of economic modesty. Raw materials and the export opportunities would come from Southeast Asia. The limits of the plan were obvious to Japan's leaders.
Early Japanese post-war Prime Minister Yoshida once put it very pithily. He said Japan doesn't want to trade with beggars. And he dismissed Southeast Asia as a region of beggars. He wanted the big leagues, Western Europe and the United States. The Japanese always maintained their sights on those markets. The Americans thought the Japanese recovery, again, would be a minor league recovery. The Japanese would make low-price, low-quality manufactured goods and textiles for a developing world. The Japanese were interested in much bigger game.
On the battlefront in Korea, United Nations forces fight desperately to meet the Red attack. Here, our troops must face what General MacArthur has termed a new war.
For the United States, the war in Korea was proof that world communism was a threat. For the Japanese, it was a chance to break out of the beggar's circle. Prime Minister Yoshida said it was a gift from the gods. Japan's protector would fight the war. Japan would reap the benefits.
When the Korean War broke out in the summer of 1950, the United States immediately began procuring so-called special procurements of automotive parts, of textiles, of walkie-talkies. Obviously, these became the electronics industry, the clothing industry, the automotive industry of the subsequent decades. In a 10 or 15-year period, as much as $10 billion was spent by the Defense Department in procuring military supplies in Japan.
Japanese industry was jump-started with orders worth $1 million a day. The Bank of Japan called it divine aid. Americans were so anxious to get their military supplies produced fast and efficiently, they taught Japanese industry how to run assembly lines and the secrets of quality control. Japan's industrial base was given the potential to mass-produce high-quality exports good enough for the world market. When the war orders started rolling in, Toyota's chairman confessed to a feeling of tingling joy.
A little more than 6 years after their surrender in Tokyo Bay, the Japanese are headed by Premier Shigeru Yoshida, who signs the document that restores his country to the family of sovereign nations. A short time later at the Presidio, a second pact is concluded, this time binding Japan and the United States, former enemies, in a mutual defense pact that provides the United States with bases in Japan.
The American bases in Japan were vital to the global Cold War strategy. Japan could continue on its path to economic wealth under the American shield. But the price of protection was to be a bigger role in the deployment of military power in the Pacific. The only nation that had suffered the agony of an atomic attack became a critical link in the West's nuclear warfighting strategy. In 1960, the defense treaty was renegotiated. For those Japanese who wanted non-alignment, it was the time to protest. '60 was a year of bitter confrontation throughout Japan. President Eisenhower was to visit Tokyo to sign the new treaty. His press secretary, James Haggerty, went ahead to make arrangements.
At Tokyo's International Airport, crowds were divided into pro- and anti-American groups as Mr. Haggerty arrived to prepare for the president's visit. Left-wing demonstrators had threatened violence, but police precautions were thought adequate.
Haggerty's visit triggered a major anti-American demonstration.
One mile from the airport, the trap was sprung. 10,000 shouting demonstrators surrounded the car in which Haggerty rode with Ambassador Douglas MacArthur II. They slashed the tires, broke 2 windows, hurled stones, and attempted to overturn the car. After an hour and 20 minutes, a Marine helicopter arrived to rescue the United States officials and end the ordeal by mob.
Haggerty's escape was close enough for the left to sense victory.
In the Japanese parliament, a drastic left-wing attempt to block the new Japanese-American Mutual Security Treaty. Japan's socialist parties and neutralists, as well as the communists, violently opposed the new 10-year treaty with the United States. On the eve of Ike's planned visits, riots and outbreaks have been ominously frequent. The speaker takes a terrific beating as government forces carry him into the House despite a frenzied last-minute stand by the opposition. Finally, Speaker Kiyoshi calls the House to order, and the treaty is voted on. The socialists abstain, but the huge pro-government, pro-American majority makes the result a foregone conclusion.
Eisenhower's visit was canceled. Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi resigned in embarrassment, but the right had won the day. Japan was locked into the new security deal. Now, the only obstacle to unrestrained economic expansion was Union militancy. 1960 was its last hurrah. The Mitsui Company was shutting down many coal mines. Miners were locked out for the whole year.
The series of miners' struggles developed into total warfare between capital and labor. In both cases, the big business, the Liberal Democratic Party, and other conservative forces won against the Unionists, the Socialist Party, and other reformist elements. And since then on, Japanese society became relatively conservative, conformist, and apolitical on the whole.
Social conformity and acceptance of the defense treaty were to be rewarded. The new Prime Minister, Hayato Ikeda, announced Japan would become rich. Massive investment in heavy industries such as steel and petrochemicals would create the infrastructure for expansion far beyond the workshop of Asia. The income for every Japanese citizen would be doubled by 1970. The 60s was Japan's decade, the golden years of supergrowth, 10% every year. But this relentless economic success would begin to unravel the post-war balance of power in the Pacific. The bases in Japan were central to the American effort in Vietnam. But as the war dragged on, U.S. military and economic policies moved out of alignment. By 1970, the United States had transferred to Japan $10 billion in aid and trade. Japan's exports were so cheap they were undermining American manufacturing. The yen was still fixed at its 1949 level. The textile industry that the United States had rebuilt for Japan in the 40s was hurting American workers. In August 1971, President Nixon decided Japan's economic program of the past decade had taken advantage of American protection and support. He politely explained it to Congress.
15 years ago, a prominent world statesman put this problem that we confronted then in a very effective way. He commented to me that world trade was like a poker game in which the United States then had all the chips, and that we had to spread them around so that others could play. What he said was true in the 1940s. It was partially true in the 50s, and also even partially true in the early 60s. It is no longer true today. We have generously passed out the chips. Now others can play on an equal basis, and we must play the game as we expect and want them to do.
The poker story was light relief for the hard reality. He was dumping the system that pegged the dollar to gold. It was the end of the undervalued yen. To drive the point home, he slapped a 10% tax on all imports. For the first time since 1945, the United States was acting as though Japan was once more an adversary.
It would be hard for me to believe that they didn't really know that something like that was coming. All you had to do was look at the tea leaves, by which I mean look at the statistics on trade and so forth, and the basic shifts in trade balances throughout the world.
So-called Nixon shock of 71, which was really a shock for us, that unexpected shock. However, the shock gave the Japanese industrialists that something must be done, otherwise they will be finished.
The 60s delivered supergrowth, but dependency on foreign resources. 80% of Japan's oil came from the Persian Gulf. When the OPEC nations quadrupled the price of oil in 1973, supergrowth collapsed. The old fear of poverty emerged. But the planners had been looking at the tea leaves. Instead of stalling, the economy would be driven out of heavy industry. New industries and new supplies would deliver the rich men's markets. Industrial policy was the vehicle of the dream.
Until the late 1960s, governmental affirmative action on the behalf of industry had been basically for the heavy industries, for heavy and chemical, for the steel industry, the chemical industry, the automobile industry, things of this sort. By the late 1960s, the so-called golden 60s, as the Japanese saw it, Japan's economy was fully recovered, and the problem now becomes a different one, namely higher value added and providing a large number of high value-added jobs for Japanese. That is, the move into the things that Japan is now world famous for: numerically controlled machine tools, computers, semiconductors, microelectronics, new materials.
The cheap labor days of handmade cars were gone. High tech took over the assembly line. Productivity replaced economic growth as the measure of success. Quality was now cheap. By the 1980s, Japan's auto industry would move into the world luxury car market. Productivity was only one side of the new industrial policy. The other side was to give a new twist to the old story: resources.
When I was young, I believed it was only possible for countries with plenty of natural resources, like the USA, the Soviet Union, and Australia, to be the dominant world powers. But I now know that a country without natural resources can be even stronger than rich countries. What you need is versatile production skills and trade. Processing other countries' resources can create a nation's wealth.
The intensity of Japan's creative resource strategy has touched every country in the Pacific. The guiding principle of trade policy is diversification, as many suppliers as possible. That's why sugar planters in the Philippines deserted their cane fields. Landowners in Papua New Guinea were persuaded to level their rainforest. And Australian miners were convinced there were huge profits to be made supplying Japan's new energy demands. In the decade of supergrowth, Japan's steel industry was the biggest influence in developing Australia's exports of coal and iron. Australia became Japan's #1 supplier, its first Western client state. In the 70s, as Japan moved away from Middle East oil, the trend grew. Australia became even more dependent on Japan as it dug deeper to produce coal for electricity. But so did Canada and South Africa. The power of Japan's great trading companies played the world market to keep prices down. In the new Pacific economic structure, Australia was allowed the important but limited role of Japan's quarry. Back in Japan, increased consumption of foreign resources created new problems. The move to high-tech was supposed to use less energy and minimize waste. The computer revolution promised the paperless office, but pulp and paper consumption has boomed. Part of the garbage that's filling up Tokyo Bay was once Pacific rainforest. Japan's own resources could never supply the new demand for pulp and paper. Nearly 1/3 of Japan's natural timber was gone by 1960. Half of what grows now was planted since the war, most of it too young to cut. Today, the traders import $7 billion worth of timber a year from Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, and beyond the equator from Australia, New Zealand, and the huge tropical island of Papua New Guinea. New Guinea was a German colony given to Australia during the First World War. Many of its people had no contact with outsiders until the war with Japan. Australian Army surveyors made the first accurate record of New Guinea's huge timber reserves. Before granting independence, the Australians found markets to support their colony. By the end of the 70s, Papua New Guinea was on the export trail to Japan. The chainsaw has been busy for more than a decade. Millions of dollars worth of tropical hardwood has been shipped out, but the returns have been minimal. The trading companies dominate logging throughout the Pacific. Any one of them is 50 times bigger in wealth than the entire island of Papua New Guinea. And yet the companies told the government they weren't making profits from logging and chipping Papua New Guinea's rainforest.
Well, that's, always amazed us that after making losses for many years, that companies could still afford to operate. So it begs the question as to why it is that they're still operating if they're not profitable. And of course, that's quite clear now that, in fact, that was never the case. What used to happen was that companies just took advantage of the situation to maximize their profits and have them transferred through transfer pricing mechanisms overseas.
The government's response has been to impose a 2-year ban on new logging. The island's Japanese wood chip company is planting its own trees. To meet the demands of the export market, these eucalyptus trees will replace the tropical forest with 4 varieties instead of 400. Japan's decade of supergrowth meant problems at home, too. There were no environmental safeguards on the activities of steel and petrochemicals. By the 70s, a third of the people were crowded together with heavy industry along the narrow coastal strip. The main source of the people's protein had become an industrial dumping ground. The consequences were discovered at Minamata. Mercury in the food chain caused a terrible disease of genetic mutations. The old fear of poverty and loss gripped the nation. The sea itself was so poisoned, its harvest had to be buried forever.
汚染は敦賀や岩国ではついに魚を根こそぎにしてコンクリート詰めにするところまで来た。
If the Japanese were to continue their flight from poverty, their appetites would have to be satisfied from beyond their own waters. In the past 15 years, Japan has become the world's #1 importer of all marine products. A quarter of everything from the whale to the prawn. Prawns were once the delicacy for the rich. Since 1960, consumption has tripled, a third of the world's catch. News of the exponential growth reached far and wide to the Philippine island of Negros. Devastated by debt and a collapse in world sugar prices, farmers went into intensive cultivation of prawns, by aquaculture. The cost of converting plantations was huge, but prawn prices were high. So were profits at first, and there were plenty of jobs for out-of-work cane cutters. Everyone was sure that the humble prawn would save Negros. But just as with coal and timber, the trading companies were encouraging prawn farming throughout the Pacific. As new suppliers came on stream, the price of the prawn collapsed.
The price that they are buying from us is very low. The ones that are making the killing or the profit are the traders, the wholesalers, the distributors, and the retailers in Japan right now. Because at the end consumer, the price is still very high.
Before 1950, there was no domestic refrigeration in Japan. By 1990, a dozen countries around the Pacific were competing for Japan's frozen prawn trade. 200,000 tons can be stored for months in the big city cold storage warehouses. The trading companies can wait for the right price. People in Japan pay top prices. The imported frozen prawn is promoted as a symbol of the new consumer wealth. For people who still depend on their own seas, just as the Japanese once did, commercial fishing has pushed their own subsistence fishing to the margin. During the 70s, these waters were open to all outsiders. The Philippines' monstrous debt crisis meant exports to Japan came first. The Japanese treasure their own subsistence heritage, but they no longer depend for survival on the afternoon tide. Since 1970, they've increased their imports of all kinds of food 12 times. The Pacific market is controlled by Japanese demand. The lesson learned from trade with Japan has been hard. Let the supplier beware.
I don't think that Japan is selfish, but you see, our history is very unique. You see, for almost 2,000 years, Japan was isolated from the outside world. We were outside of the international community. Up to the visit of Commodore Perry in 1853, you see, we had no experience of getting communicated with, getting mixed up with the other countries. So therefore, this tradition and history still keep some inertia on the Japanese behavior.
American modernism forced Japan from the inertia of isolation. There was no concept of how far it would lead, who would suffer, what was fair. The United States made an ally, a rival, and an empire. But Japan still depends on American technology and protection. The hardware for Tokyo's Astro Camp comes from NASA. For the rest of this century, Japanese attitudes will be the focus of intense speculation. Ruthless competition for markets and resources will be hard to justify. Sustaining prosperity will be the new challenge. In 1860, no one was allowed to leave Japan. In 1990, 10 million Japanese are taking foreign vacations. Intermingling with the rest of the world is now official government policy. 200,000 young Japanese take the Saipan package. The feeling is so much like home, it might be the old Greater Japan. Saipan is also a place to reflect on the price of the quest for paradise. This generation may yet make its own sacrifice. The power in the Pacific has shifted. International responsibility must follow. It's the new price of power.